And the Darfur region is filled with oil, right? And that's the region where all the oil in Sudan is. And Obama has recently met with the president of Sudan and said, we'll take you off the list of foreign sponsors of terror if you hand the Darfur region over to the United Nations and let them control it. So again, you can see that in African and in all world politics, just like the Libyan guy was not being held because they really believed, and then, you know, all of a sudden they just came to the conclusion that he had to go free. The same is with Sudan. They have no conclusive evidence that Sudan is a state sponsor of terror. They have conclusive evidence that they want the oil in Darfur. And if he's willing to give up Darfur, all of a sudden they'll not have any evidence that he's a state sponsor of terror, right? And that's the history of U.S. imperialism in Africa.
And also the U.S. Holocaust Museum is a strong sponsor of that. And they charge genocide of the people in Darfur.
Well, by who, though? I mean there's no question that there is mass death going on in Darfur. But the mass death is the result of a war between the U.S. imperialist Christian fundamentalists and the local population who are aided by the Sudanese state. So the question is, I mean, all these pictures they have are real, but the question is, where does the blame lie? And what the Save Darfur movement would have you believe is that the government of Sudan is just committing massacres, right? Mm-hmm. And then the weirdest thing is, if you actually go and look at what the Save Darfur movement advocates for Sudan, they advocate sanctions in Sudan, not allowing food to be shipped into Sudan, right? Blocking Sudan's right to medical aid, preventing China from sending the hospitals and the technicians in. So essentially, the Save Darfur movement's goal is to save Darfur by starving Darfur. That's what the goal is, right? It's the same way, you know, that we were told that Saddam Hussein was an evil dictator. Therefore, we have to starve the country and not allow medicine or health care to get in. And the result was, we'll save them by starvation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the logic of imperialism. That, a lot of people don't know what sanctions means. It's kind of a joke that, a professor, right? If they're convicted of some wrongdoing on the campus, first they're admonished, and then they're sanctioned. Right, and then after that they're given 2 years without pay. Right, sanctions, you think it doesn't mean anything, which in a workplace, especially a tenured track professor, it means nothing. Right, but sanctions in terms of foreign relations means starvation and death. Right, it means no chlorine can be sent in because you could possibly use chlorine to make a chemical weapon. However, you also use it, to purify the water so people don't die from drinking water. Right, I mean, and that's the imperialist method, and I mean the same people who told us, Nelson Mandela was an evil terrorist, are the same people that want to free Sudan by starving at the same. And now Zimbabwe is another situation, right? Mm-hmm. Zimbabwe's currency has gone up like 300 times in the last year, and the reason it's gone up 300 times is because international banks, have been manipulating the currency in order to destroy the Zimbabwean currency and destroy the Zimbabwean economy.
How is that possible?
Through the setting of exchange rates, right? It's a financial operation. I'm sure Craig could get into more detail about that in a minute. But they have been causing this inflation because Robert Mugabe has committed the crime of trying to redistribute the property of Western corporations. Mm-hmm. 90% of the land in Zimbabwe has been owned by 10 families. All right, since the colonization of Rhodesia. And Mugabe, after overthrowing the government for the first time, in his revolutionary history, actually began to enact the programs that he had won the revolution on the basis of redistributing land. And for that crime, now, everyone wants to save Zimbabwe. And if it weren't for North Korea and China, the Zimbabwean government would have been overthrown as well. The Chinese have sent numerous aid, numerous literacy volunteers and all that. And North Korea, interestingly enough, has sent their army.
The record is not unblemished.
Can we get into that in the discussion?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. The North Koreans have sent their armies there to aid Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe has been demonized recently as a Maoist and a crazed revolutionary. And I was even watching, even the liberals are bad on this. You'll notice the liberals, interestingly enough, the liberals, they're not as hardcore and open about their imperialistic intentions, but they're very big on presenting their imperialist foreign policy, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, as humanitarianism, right? We just care so much. But recently, the government of Senegal, right, to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of their independence, contracted the North Koreans to build them a statue. I encourage everyone to Google it, the memorial. This statue is huge and it's beautiful, right? And it shows an African woman and a man with a rifle, right? And a European proletarian, you know, joined together with this beautiful statue of them, you know, pumping a fist, and it's the memorial of their independence, right? And it's a beautiful symbol of resistance and all that. And they have demonized the government of Senegal for, quote, supporting North Korea by letting them build a statue, even though the North Koreans gave them a very good deal on it. You know, it was, it's the same thing. I mean, all who talk about Soviet imperialism in Africa, the aid that the Soviets gave to Angola, I mean, even when they bought products, you know, when they bought oil from Angola, they bought it at 3 times the market rate because they were providing aid. Right? As Francis pointed out in some of our discussion, you know, people tried to claim that that the Soviets exploited Cuba for sugar, but the Soviets had beet sugar natively. They didn't even have to buy Cuban sugar, and when they bought it at 3 times the price to aid the Cubans. Right? The Soviets played such a positive role in Africa, and sadly enough, China played a very negative role until recently in Africa, because China again sided with UNITA, you know, sided with the FNLA.
They did?
You know, in Angola, yes. Yes, in the name of fighting the Soviet social imperialists. And, you know, China historically, the one good event that China did play was Tanzania. And when Tanzania had its revolutionary revolt, China did build railroads all through Tanzania. And they made a point that every Chinese technician who was sent in did not have a bigger salary or better living conditions than the local Tanzanian people, right? And a point. But, I mean, China defended Haile Selassie. Right, and you know, China historically, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the name of being anti-Soviet, was playing a very negative role in Africa, and it wasn't until recently that their role has been one of international solidarity, right? But the imperialists were always hoping to divide the socialist bloc of countries, because the last thing they wanted was a united front of socialist countries fighting for independence, right? And whether it's the question of uniting the socialist camp and uniting the working class for its own interests has been the burning question in the African Revolution. And you know, I would encourage people to see the leaders of the African Revolution. The strongest leaders were ones that said imperialism is our enemy, not other communists, not other Africans. Right? The Kwame Nkrumah, the great revolutionary, called for Africans to unite and drive out the imperialists. Right? And it was that was the force that led to the liberation and the victories that brought down apartheid in South Africa, destroyed the Rhodesian apartheid regime. Those were the victories, were the forces that said our enemy is imperialism, our enemy is not other Africans. And that's what's been summed up by the various African revolutionaries as the lesson to be learned from the history of revolts in the African continent.
The things that astounded me when I first started reading Workers' World newspaper was the approach they had to Mugabe, because it was so different from the class collaborationist understanding of him and his policies, to where, you know, some land was going to be nationalized, but only for the people who supported his party, and people who supported his party who were landowners didn't get their land nationalized. You know, it was I always had an understanding of Mugabe as a complete opportunist until I started reading. But you know, a lot of that is kind of cherry picking facts among.
Well, I suspected this fellow believed whatever this church told him.
Well,
because not only was he like militantly religious, but one of his criticisms was the robbing the rich. You know? I didn't mention it earlier because I didn't think it was relevant.
Right.
That was another one of his criticisms, just taking people's land. Another
interesting thing you have to keep in mind is U.S. intelligence often operates in Africa through Christian missionaries. You know, Bush would always get on TV in a State of the Union and announce he was getting so much aid to fight AIDS in Africa. But if you actually looked at what that money was going to, it was to fund groups that taught abstinence-only education throughout Africa and also promoted fundamentalist Christianity.